All right. Here today we have Chandler Culotta, who is a fine art photographer based in Southwest Florida. As an artist, his work explored a multitude of genres. Chandler's works to bring his visions and experiences to the viewer, pulling them into the way he sees the world around us. He has worked extensively in both fine art and commercial fields of photography, exploring conceptual based projects that range from introspective self portraiture to environmental conservatism. He has worked as a photojournalist for publications such as Creative Loafing in Tampa Bay, QRO Magazine, and the Florida Trident. He also works closely with clients in portraiture and event coverage. His work has been exhibited in multiple galleries, including Black Box Gallery, the Rhode Island Center for Photographic Arts, and studios at 5663. And he was recently selected as an editor's pick for the Lens Culture Art Photography Awards of 2026. Chandler received his Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Tampa and his Master of Fine Arts in Photography and Related Media from the Rochester Institute of Technology, which is where we actually had met as we were both grad students at the time. Chandler currently teaches photography and digital arts at St. Petersburg College in Pinellas, is that how you pronounce it?
Pinellas.
Pinellas, County, Florida. So please welcome Chan.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to kind of talk about my work and everything I've done over kind of my career. So I'm going to be going through everything I've done since like really diving into fine art photography in undergrad, as well as some of my photojournalism work, and just mainly focusing on the fine art and photojournalism work that I've done. So for kind of background, like Lynn said, I studied photography and my BFA at the University of Tampa. I went there from 2017 to 2022. My first 2 years, I originally started as a marine bio major, but I switched over halfway through. I'd been photographing and working with cameras since I was 16, but I'd only really saw photography as a hobby, and I really didn't plan to have it be my main profession. But then when I switched from my Bachelor's of Science, marine bio, to my BFA, that's when I really started diving in more with photography. So with photography, my first dip into kind of the world of fine art photography was when I took a darkroom class in the fall of 2019. I just switched my degree over the previous spring while taking an intro digital course, but I hadn't really played around with any sort of heavy conceptual artwork series. Learned a lot more about contemporary photographic artists during that class, looking at photographers like Gregory Crutzen, W. Eugene Smith, Ansel Adams, and more. I was heavily interested in more conceptual based work that acts more as narratives to tell stories, and was often basing a lot of my early work on the music and the songs I listened to. So that was a big important thing for me when I was first working as a photographer, and still is. So I spent a lot of time photographing and taking portraits of my friends and my family around Tampa Bay, and then back home in Estero, Florida, which is around Fort Myers, Naples area. Um, just posing them and using props such as smoke bombs, playing with lighting at different locations to create the images, and often shooting at nighttime around all these different areas that I was photographing in. This is also when I first started diving into more self-portraiture work, which is something I continued much further in my digital work during my undergrad program, especially after I'd taken a studio lighting course and I procured my own strobe for at home. So I started diving in more with that self-portraiture, especially digital image manipulation during 2020 and 2021. This was when we went into the COVID lockdown. So I was living by myself, and of course, a lot of people. I was struggling with kind of my mental health at the time. So I ended up deciding to kind of explore these feelings and these emotions through photography, and utilizing it as kind of an art therapy practice with my work. I like to call this phase, this self-portraiture phase of my work, as my edgy, sad artist phase. And I was really interested in this process of compositing and chose to utilize self-portraits of myself and parts of my body to create kind of somewhat abstract self-portraiture. And again, I was continuing to use music as a helpful inspiration for my work, often using lyrics to create my own symbolism within my artwork that represented different emotions and statements on my own mental health and both my own in general. So the symbolism really helped me a lot in exploring that. I also started in undergrad was when I started learning about alternative processes in photography. My professor, Jamie A. Leventhera, primarily focused in cyanotypes and gum prints. So I learned a lot about alternative processes from her. Cyanotypes are one of my main focuses, and it's a process I still practice today, focusing on primarily experimenting with new botanicals to use as toners. I also worked in a few other different alternative processes, creating work with salt prints, film transfers like you see here, and also experimenting with alterations to my prints, often through the use of selective burning and some mixed media. The class I was taking at the time was called experimental photography. So it was all about experimenting with our work and playing around with how we create photographs and trying to expand that medium beyond just your simple darkroom silver gelatin print or your digital inkjet prints as well. So during that same time when I was working on this work with my self-portraiture, I also was working a lot as a photojournalist, and I covered a wide range of things, kind of more political movements to music and more, and just basic events around town. So in 2020, I got out and was shooting a lot and photographing for the Black Lives Matter movement during the summer of 2020. I was acting as a contributing photographer for a local publication, Creative Loafing Tampa Bay. So I was attending protests around the city and photographing them. I worked alongside several other photographers and photojournalists, working in tandem with each other, as well as collaborating with the local protest leaders for the locations and plans for the different protests, getting ideas on where we should be, and also working with them to help use our photography for investigations into the police force in Tampa. Some of these investigations also led us to discover that the Tampa police during this time had upped their use of more not violent kind of or aggressive behavior and responses to protests by like 538%. So that was a big investigation we did. And I was out nearly every day documenting these protests and movements, returning at night to edit and send my photographs off to the publication and the editors, as well as working on my own projects, as the projects you saw earlier. Then, in a similar vein, kind of jumping around, I began photographing the protests that occurred in the wake of the Roe v. Wade overruling in 2022. Once again, traveling to different areas and different protests within the area and documenting all of those movements, whether they were very small with only a few people or large gatherings outside of the City Hall for Tampa or St. Pete, Clearwater, and so on. So rain or shine, I was once again following the different protest groups, like I said, as they occurred across the Tampa Bay area. The photojournalism is what really got me out into the field and, having to understand to work fast and being able to work in some, inclement situations and weather and so on and so forth. I had just finished my undergrad program when I was documenting the Roe v. Wade overruling, and I'd also just returned from a trip in Paris. So as soon as I had returned, I immediately just hit the ground running out to these protests and documenting them as much as I could and providing those images for Creative Loafing Tampa Bay, as they're a big publication that tries to work with protests and activists and giving just news and information about Tampa Bay area. I was also very focused on music photography. That was my main focus. So I was sent out to different concerts and music festivals to photograph and write reviews on the concerts, basically summing up everything that happened, what the musicians said, and how they interacted with the crowd, and also providing the set list for each of the concerts. So I was working both kind of back of house in the crowds to photograph, as well as in the photo pits. Been to a concert, you ever see that area between the stage and the crowd? That's the photo pit. I was one of those guys working up front in there. So I was doing kind of your traditional concert photographs that you normally see from, just the concerts. But I was also trying to experiment with my shots and attempting to capture the actual energy of these events, not just the performers by themselves. So I was often moving around in the crowd, trying to get different angles and locations for these images. Also looking at things like where the musicians are interacting with the crowd and so on and so forth. Music photography is actually what convinced me to switch into my BFA, as in 2019, I joined the Gasparilla Music Festival and media team. It's one of our local music festivals as a student photographer, actually the first student photographer from the University of Tampa. During that time on the student media team, I was taught by some of the more experienced photographers on that team on how to photograph concerts and music festivals and learning about things like the angles, editing, working with publications, and more and more. Later on, I was eventually moved up to one of the head photographers, being in charge of the student team that I was once a student on, as well as being in charge of the team that photographed the vendors and the food that was sold at the festival. So working a lot more kind of in that commercial sense as well, and kind of in a still life sense. And then just like the people who mentored me my first year working with the festival, I worked with both high school and undergrad students, teaching them that same knowledge that I learned about settings, angles, how to navigate the photo pits and the crowds, and more. Again, like working with publications and how to get your work out and how to contact publications and begin working with them. Most of my work in music was with Crow Magazine, but I also worked a little bit with Creative Loafing, documenting concerts for them. With Crow, they sent me out to many different concerts, most of which were of my own choice, to photograph and write the reviews on them. Crow has photographers in every city in the United States and a lot of cities internationally. So I was essentially the Tampa Bay photographer. So I would cover a lot of the concerts there if nobody was covering them in a different set or a different part of the tour. So I spent most of my weekends and some of my weeknights doing this in undergrad. One of the other bonuses too with this work was that I also got to choose the concerts I wanted to go to. So I got to go and see all the bands that I really liked, and also have some of the bands I really liked invite me out to give reviews on their concerts. And these reviews, again, what I would cover everything. I would write what I saw. I'd give the details on the locations, even sometimes with outdoors, the weather. I also, outside of just your typical concert work, I also worked on a few live music shows. So a good friend of mine, Ken, ran mainly two different ones in the Tampa Bay area. One of which was the Coda project, his own personal project. And on that project, we'd invite local artists and sometimes some bigger name artists to perform, and sometimes local artists who are now big names. I'm sure some of you might recognize the name here, Doechii. She won a Grammy last year in 2025. And she's a St. Pete, Tampa Bay local. And we got to photograph her pretty earlier on in her career before she really started blowing up. The other show that I worked on was the WMNF 88.5 FM Live Music Showcase, which was broadcasted on live radio and live streamed online on Fridays. We would, again, have musicians just like the Coda Project, both local and larger names, such as Alt J, as you see here, and the Beaches, perform in our live recording studio. And again, we broadcast that onto the air and we live stream it online. We had them perform live, but we also interview them for both of these projects and got to kind of hear about their work as musicians, their experiences, their approaches and practices to music as well. So jumping a bit, kind of flashing forward, when I first started grad school in 2022, that in the fall in October, my hometown of Fort Myers was hit directly by Hurricane Ian. So at the time when I found out about this, when this was going on, I flew back down as soon as the airports opened back up to check on my family, my friends, and my community, and also began photographing the damage and destruction from the hurricane. So I approached this from kind of a more local's point of view, which is what was encouraged to me by one of the editor-in-chief at Creative Loafing, Tampa Bay, and covered the damage and wrote articles on it. So while I was down there, I reached out to the editor-in-chief and told him I was back home and photographing the damage, and I offered to provide photographs and the articles over the days I was there. So I traveled all around the Southwest Florida region between Naples and Fort Myers, looking at that damage that the different residential and business areas suffered from, primarily the coastal areas. Fort Myers at the time didn't have the best infrastructure for hurricanes, as it's usually incredibly rare for the west coast of Florida to get hit by hurricanes. Hurricanes have to have a really wide curve to come in and hit us. So it was completely unprepared, and Fort Myers also only had about 24 hours to prepare for the hurricane as it had changed its path pretty quickly. But with the changes in the climate and so on, there's been a lot more common times where hurricanes are starting to come and hit the West Coast, especially with more recently Hurricane Milton and Helene. So with that infrastructure, because a lot of these houses and these buildings weren't fully built to withstand hurricanes, save for a few houses that were updated and a lot of more of the hotels and public buildings, the damage was so vast that the entirety of Fort Myers Beach and those other coastal areas was wiped out. They were completely submerged. Houses were gone. Some houses were, you could see where they were basically dragged out into the ocean. So I traveled around photographing the destruction, also traveling to a few of the relief areas that had been set up in different areas of Fort Myers and Southwest Florida, trying to capture both the damage, but also how the community was coming together to try and work and support with each other. And also photographing a little bit of some of the outside supports that we had from other sheriff's departments in Florida, the National Guard, even the New York National Guard, who sent down 2 of their Chinook helicopters to help with some of the barrier islands that were cut off. So I wrote 3 stories for each day that I was out photographing. These stories were probably, I mean, definitely compared to the music that I've done, were the heaviest ones I've ever written. And I was encouraged again to do so since I'm a local. Essentially, I just didn't hold back in my articles. I gave some pretty gritty details with it because I really wanted to show people what was going on down here. A lot of the photojournalists that were coming in were not from the Fort Myers area and the Southwest Florida area. So from the local point of view, I was able to give a lot more information on these locations. I won't go into the details too much about, what I was writing about, what I've seen, but there was some pretty heavy traumatic things that you witness, especially in post hurricanes, you don't often see, especially with some of those rescue efforts. So the headline here, I think it's safe to say, kind of give you an idea on the things that we were witnessing and experiencing following this hurricane. So kind of going back a bit to my work in music photography, this leads me up to my first major project, The Lines Between My Lyrics. This was my undergrad BFA capstone for when I graduated in 2022. So having worked in music and especially working on those live shows with local Tampa Bay music scene, a lot of local musicians who I'd go out with to photograph their concerts or the events they were playing in, and even creating some promo material for them, such as album covers and just things to just use on social media and for advertising. I got to know a lot of the music scene in Tampa Bay. So I wanted to create a project that explored the importance of music, especially the importance of it to these specific musicians. Again, I listened to music my entire life, and I've been drawn to it as this art form in itself, as it really is. And also how his act is sort of this therapeutic release for some people, very similar to my earlier work where I was using photography as my own therapeutic kind of release. So with the project, I reached out to different musicians that I knew. I got linked up with some other musicians that I just now met, and I brought them into the studio where I lit them up and photographed them with their instruments. So I chose to photograph different musicians working in different genres of music, ranging from dark wave / pop all the way up to kind of rock, country, and even jazz. I also wanted to photograph these different musicians as a way to show their different instruments that they use with their work. Some were using guitars, see on the next slide, some were saxophone, they were jazz artists, and others were using mixers and their laptops to create their songs, or some were just purely vocal. The biggest part of this project was to explore what music meant for those actual artists, not just the listeners. So I asked each artist one simple question. I had them kind of fill out a form and reply to it. And that simple question was, what does music mean to you? So each musician, in their own words, had their own and individual answers and how they view music and its importance. Creating this diverse introspective on the musical world and seeing how people utilize music to kind of tell stories, like as you see on this slide, and how they can explore different themes and emotions and so on. So with those responses they gave, that became tied to their photograph and became the actual titles for each of the pieces. So on these slides, the text you've been seeing off on the left side is the actual quotes, what these musicians replied to. And I utilize these quotes as the actual entirety of the title of the piece. The answers were incredibly interesting and beautiful, especially with the consideration that the musicians I photographed were all different ages and for the most part in slightly different genres. You have the older generation of musicians who have done this for years and years and could really dive in on their experiences from when they first started to where they are now. And then you also have the younger musicians who really opened up about their emotions with music and what music means to them and talking about, like in the previous slide, talking about how they don't know what they would do if they didn't have music in their life, especially being able to create their own music. So the project accumulated into, again, my BFA capstone show. And for that installation, I worked with a very large scale of printing. I often work in pretty large scales of printing, as you'll see in some of my other work coming up. So these pieces were printed at 4 feet by 5 feet. I utilized white frames to really create this kind of seamless, putting them in this just white space so that you're only focusing on the actual musician. The portraits were nearly life size, so that as the readers or as the viewers read their statements, they could feel as if the musician was talking kind of directly to them. I also included, as you can see a little bit on this image, I also included QR codes to these musicians' websites, YouTube's, SoundCloud, Spotify's, so on, so that viewers were also able to scan those QR codes and listen to their music while they looked at their statements and examined their portraits. So the project was installed for the BFA capstone show in 2022 at the University of Tampa in the Scarfone Hartley Gallery, where it stayed up for a few weeks. We gave artist talks on them, so forth. So after completing this project, I graduated at University of Tampa and moved up to Rochester, New York in the fall of 2022 to do my Master's of Fine Arts in Photography and Related Media at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And this is where I met Lynn. So coming from Florida, I was really intrigued and enthralled by the landscapes of upstate New York. I've been a big nature enjoyer and lover my entire life. My parents have taken me on hikes since before I could walk or even talk, especially when I was growing up in Tennessee and Kentucky. Florida had become my home, even though I wasn't originally from there. It still is my home. And so I was accustomed to the flat landscapes we have here in Florida. Kind of give you guys an idea, I often will go on hikes down here where my elevation gain is 0 feet. We don't have your traditional hiking that you have kind of further up north in these mountainous regions. So I was really interested and enthralled by that more mountainous area in the Northeast. So I spent a lot of my time just traveling around the state, going to all these different locations. My first month of being in Rochester, I didn't have a lot of my stuff with me. I was still waiting for it to be delivered. And so all I had with me was my gear, an air mattress, and my clothes. So I loaded up my truck and just spent about 2 weeks just on the road, living out of it, traveling in different places. I would take camping trips to explore some of the smaller towns and focus on hitting some of these major parks and areas first before going into the smaller parks and preserves. So I revisited a lot of the same locations over different seasons, and I began to really dive into more methods and techniques with landscapes. I've done a little bit of landscape beforehand when I first started into photography, but I really hadn't gotten into the full techniques of it and like specialized techniques such as utilizing neutral density filters and creating panoramas and making HDR bracketing images. So I really started to play around with those methods and those techniques, as well as understanding more of the kind of compositions you can create within kind of Lightroom Classic and Photoshop. One of the biggest things that caught my attention when I was living in upstate New York was the amount of waterfalls that were there. I'd never really seen waterfalls like these, especially in Florida. We don't really have waterfalls. So I hadn't really gotten to experience this kind of diverse landscape that you have up in upstate New York. To give you an idea, there's hundreds of waterfalls in this region, with over 150 within just a 10-mile radius of Ithaca. So there's lots of waterfalls you can go and see. So during my graduate time as well, during that first fall semester, I took a class, and in that class we had a few weeks where we were working on creating our own books for our projects. So I learned a lot more about bookmaking, especially bookmaking by hand. So I made a few different books based on my travels around upstate New York, kind of acting as these catalogs. Um, but I'm going to show you guys kind of one of the main ones that I made in grad school, which is this book here, Falls. So with my fascination to the falls around upstate New York, I created a book with the process of cyanotypes using digital negatives. So with this project, each page features different waterfalls. Some are in the same parks, some are in different parks, but they're all scattered across the region. And I really wanted to explore this really interesting and almost kind of foreign landscape for me. I was experimenting with different papers as well at this time. I'd only really used watercolor paper. So I started playing with some more kind of bookmaking paper and printing paper as well, and experimenting with that to create these books. I chose to use kind of watercolor paper for the front and back covers, and I used what French paper, a very, very thin paper, as the main pages. So there's a lot of experimentation and a lot of pages that I went through that ripped, that I had to kind of redo. I wanted to use the cyanotype process for this project as I found that very deep cyan blue really built off the fact that these landscape features were aquatic. They're very aquatic features. So I wanted to use that deep blue of the cyanotype to really reflect on these landscapes. So like I said, I made several other books during my graduate time, all based on my travels and camping trips, often acting as catalogs of locations I was in. I would make kind of catalogs based off of each day and each location that I was in. My approach was very scientific in nature, kind of calling back to my work and my undergraduate first 2 years when I was a marine bio major, and returning to those interests in science and nature to really explore these. With this book as well, I also wanted to use it as like I said, as a documentation of my explorations and my adventures. So with the back cover, I took a map of New York State, kind of outline of the New York State, and I placed stars in each spot where the waterfalls are found to really document and show these locations, and also acting as a way for this book to people have to go to these locations and have their own explorations and experiences with them. With talking about where I traveled in upstate New York, I like to show this map as anytime I travel to different places, I like to save in my maps places I've gone to. So in this map, you can see kind of everywhere I explored in New York. I spent a lot of time, still do pretty often here and there, spent a lot of time on the road and camping in different locations. So during my main first kind of 2 years, my first year into my second year, I spent a lot more time in the Finger Lakes region, which is that area kind of down in the center where you see where it says Geneva. And I explored a lot in there, but then later on, as I got into my final semester, I started moving more east, exploring kind of Adirondacks and the Catskills and hitting some of those more major mountains. I also did some adventures outside of New York State. I often would travel to some areas down in Pennsylvania. I even went up to Toronto, Canada. And I also did about a week-long stay in Acadia Bay National Park, really trying to take in as much as I could during my 2 years of these such diverse landscapes and building on my techniques as a landscape photographer. I also brought these techniques as a landscape photographer on some of my other travels. In 2023, in the summer of 2023, I spent 2 weeks down in Argentina visiting one of my best friends who was living in Buenos Aires at the time. And we traveled kind of all over the country for a week, for the first week. We went from Buenos Aires to Iguazu Falls, which is the largest waterfall in South America. Spent a few days in Iguazu Falls, and then we also did some travels out over to Mendoza, and also took a ferry over to Colonia del Sacramento in Uruguay. This is also when I started moving from landscape also into nature photography. I had just recently procured a big wildlife lens, the one you saw on that first slide. So I was doing a lot of work photographing wildlife. So wildlife became a new big thing for me to add to my nature work in photographing these different places I traveled to. I really was drawn to the work of kind of the Nat Geo photographers. So I was really, really interested in creating these photographs and working out in the field that way. So my work as a landscape photographer and becoming drawn into that landscape led me to create my graduate thesis among cypress and sawgrass. I wanted to take my interest in the landscape that I really found in upstate New York and from the documentations and the photographs I was creating up there and bring it into the area that I call home, which is Southwest Florida. It's the Everglades region of South Florida, which is essentially, if you've ever looked at a map of Florida, it's from Lake Okeechobee that you see and just south the entire tip of the peninsula. So I wanted to build this project on that Everglades region, again called Monk Cypress and Sawgrass, that focused on the importance of conserving this region and this environment. So I made some different approaches to this project than I did in my previous work. I wasn't doing a lot of your kind of just traditional landscapes where you just set up high up on a mountain peak and shoot because, well, we don't have mountains in Florida. So I wanted to try and create these more dynamic compositions with my work, both with wildlife and with the actual landscape. So I wanted to show the beauty of the Everglades and the wetlands of South Florida in this project, especially because many people immediately go to the thought of it being this mosquito and alligator infested swamp. Technically, they're not wrong, but oftentimes people are completely overlooking the actual beauty of this landscape due to those factors. I really wanted to dive in and talk about the importance of conserving this landscape since the Everglades had been threatened for so many years before it was actually preserved and actually marked for conservation. And a lot of development and rise of industrialization in that area in the 1900s and even agriculture led to a declining ecosystem. Again, going back to what I was mentioning about trying to create these new dynamic areas and point of views, I was seeking out to photograph just everything that I could. So a lot of it wasn't just the trees and the sawgrass and more of the kind of terrestrial areas, but I also did some photographs underwater in certain cypress domes and other sloughs and strands within the landscape. These kind of turned into what I call the kind of aquatic, the underwater jungles, as the Everglades is one of the most biologically diverse regions in the country. So you have such diverse different subbiomes within this ecosystem, with everything looking so different from your cypress domes to mahogany hammocks to even underwater where you have all these new colors that you don't see on the surface. Another big part of this project when it comes to talking about the conservation was moving not only focusing on the natural landscape, but documenting and looking at the way that humans have affected the landscape, especially going back to what I mentioned with development, the industrialized society, and agriculture. So I photographed evidence of humans, whether it was the act of construction or development, areas that were attempted to be developed in, or the remnants of the logging industry and other colonization and urbanization that occurred in the region before it was preserved. So I travel out to all these different locations, documenting as much as I could and looking for that kind of this evidence of humans. The work was very much influenced by Clyde Butcher. If you're unfamiliar with him, he is like the Florida landscape photographer. He's also regarded as the new Ansel Adams. And again, also National Geographic photographers I was interested in, especially Carlton Ward Jr., who is actually based in Southwest Florida around the same area as me, photographs in a lot of the same areas as me. The project also took a little bit of inspiration from Richard Misrak's Petrochemical America, which was a project and book that he created that documented the effects of the industrialized society and refineries along the area known as Cancer Alley in Louisiana and how that affected and changed the local ecosystem, but also how it affected those local communities. So with the final work, I was playing around with how I wanted to install it and display it. Whether I wanted to do your traditional just prints and frames on the wall, or I wanted to try and build into another way of doing it, if I wanted to use alternative processes. I ended up choosing to create essentially an immersive installation for the viewers, creating this almost nearly one-to-one ratio panorama of a cypress dome, one of the cypress domes I often frequent. So I enlarged the panorama to 8 feet by 24 feet wide, and then split it into about 7 different strips that all measured 8 feet by 42.5 inches wide, utilizing an adhesive paper that was then placed onto the wall. And then atop that mural, I placed the frame images throughout it, acting as kind of these windows into that landscape and showing the different effects of humans as well as the different landscapes, as well as some of the wildlife you see there. I really was focused I'm playing with the placement of the individual images, such as placing that underwater photograph right over the area of water in the mural down there at the bottom left. And likewise with the chair photograph, which you'll see in the next slide, and having it kind of in between the surface and underneath the water. I also photographed some of the more common wildlife seen in this environment, wildlife that's especially kind of symbolism of the Everglades, such as the American alligator, the anhinga, and the endangered wood stork, which was hunted to very, very small numbers for its plumage. So, like I said, these individual images act as a sort of window into the landscape, showcasing everything in one installation. I also played around with the placement for up higher on the mural, such as the mahogany tree, the top right, and in the previous slide, the drone photograph of the burning sugarcane, which I'll get into here in a second. So I really wanted to create this interesting kind of flow with it that brought the viewers into this installation and into this landscape, essentially giving them a point of view and bringing the Everglades region and the wetlands into the gallery. One of the biggest things with this project, one of the most important parts of the project, was speaking on the sugarcane industry of Florida. So the sugarcane industry is based in the Everglades agricultural area, which is on the southern part or the southern shoreline of Lake Okeechobee. Historically, Lake Okeechobee, that southern area, during our wet seasons would flow down into the Everglades, essentially turning the entire southern tip of the peninsula into a river, which we call the River of Grass. The sugarcane industry has caused irreparable damage to that ecosystem due to water pollution from runoff with the fertilizers and also blocking the natural flow of the water south. The Everglades really relies on that water to come through to bring it back and grow it in our wet seasons, but the sugarcane industry was blocking up this water and not letting enough of it come through. So with this project, I wanted to explore kind of the issues of the sugarcane industry and even talk about how the sugarcane industry can remain, but through better methods and uses of harvesting. The sugarcane industry is one of the largest important parts of our economy in Florida. It provides lots of jobs. We're also the largest producer of sugarcane in the country as well. So it's nearly impossible to get rid of the industry altogether here in Florida, but there's ways to improve it. So with that, I created this project entirely with paper and materials from recycled materials. So the mural that I mentioned was a adhesive fabric that was made from recycled plastics and other byproducts of refining. The actual individual images are where we play into that sugarcane industry and speaking on that. These images were printed on hand milled sugarcane paper, which utilizes the byproducts of green harvested sugarcane, which is sugarcane that's not burned, nor does it use harmful fertilizers. It's grown completely naturally. So the byproducts of this sugarcane and the harvesting is what we call bagasse fibers. And these fibers are found in the leaves and the tops of the sugarcane. These are the same parts of the sugarcane that is burned using that burnt mechanical method that you see here in this image. Because of the fertilizers that are being used, as these canes are being burned, it releases more and more toxins into it. The project was also, a few images from the project were also featured in an article with the Florida Trident, focusing on the importance of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which is a stretch going across the entire state, north to south, of connected parks and preserves and farmland that is meant to allow the natural kind of migration routes and roaming routes for a lot of wildlife, especially the especially the Florida panther, which is our most endangered species, only 100 to 150 left. So with this project, the Florida Trident is the news arm for the Florida Center for Government Accountability. So we worked on this project to really dive in on some issues and some rising of developing that was happening primarily near my house down in Estero, Florida. So we wanted to go in on this project to talk about all the development and the issues it's going to cause and how there are now being issues with the ways that developers are able to obtain permits to develop over these lands. The Florida Center for Government Accountability is all about holding kind of the government accountable and making sure that they are doing and supporting what the people want. In Florida, no matter your backgrounds, your beliefs, everybody agrees, Floridians all agree that to keep Florida wild is as we say it, to protect Florida's natural ecosystem, as we've been dealing with a lot of urbanization and development that's happening with a lot of people moving here to Florida from outside of the state. So I'm still planning to continue this project for the future, and I still shoot here and there. I've been focused mainly on exploring new areas and revisiting even old ones that I'm familiar with to try and seek out new angles, as well as photographing in both the wet and dry seasons when the landscapes change drastically. Down here in Florida, we don't have your typical fall, summer, spring, and winter. We have more of a wet season and a dry season. So our winters are our dry seasons when the water is very, very low, when our summers is when the water starts to rise up a lot higher. I've also been playing with and creating more panoramas. So that whenever I do end up doing another installation, I can utilize different or more murals within one space. Whether it's completely filling the actual room, the gallery, with one mural across all the walls, or creating different areas within the gallery for different locations I shoot, such as Mayaka River State Park, Fakahatchee Strand, Big Cypress, and so on. I've also started diving in more on the human element of this project, exploring more of that colonization and remnants of urbanization and industrialization that has occurred in the Everglades and continues to occur. Kind of example with this image, Fakahatchee Strand is our largest state park, and it's also used to be a big logging area. So there's a lot of houses out there that still exist that actually generations of Floridians still live in or lived in, and also remnants of these logging camps and houses. You can even see some of the old logging trucks just rusting away in the water. So I wanted to explore these areas where there was attempts made to really try and develop and build into these areas. Some other things I've started looking into and also implementing into the project calls back to my earlier protest days. As I've started implementing some photographs from protests and demonstrations against the Everglades Detention Center, also known as Alligator Alcatraz. This is a big immigration center that was built last year on an old abandoned airstrip found in the Big Cypress National Preserve with horrible conditions and also adding to the pollution of the ecosystem, and not to mention desecrating the sacred ancestral lands of the Miccosukee and Seminole people. So a lot of demonstrations have been organized by some of the leaders within the Miccosukee and Seminole tribes, bring people together to protest and create prayer vigils against this detention center. So I've gone down to a few of these protests and prayer vigils, which happen quite often, quite regularly, photographing the people who are demonstrating right outside the front gates of the detention center. Similar manner as I was doing with my earlier protest work. So I wanted to start experimenting with implementing the photographs of the people who are defending this landscape and not just the negative human effect. So a lot of us who are protesting this are doing this right outside the front gates of the detention center. I've also been diving into a bit more with some large format photography while I'm down there, especially building off of Clyde Butcher's work, who primarily works in really only works in large format film photography. So I've started playing around with that because most of my work over my career has been mainly digital photography. So I've been getting back into film as a practice and a way for me to kind of slow down shooting. I also like to show photographs like this one on the right to give people kind of a behind the scenes sense on what it takes for me to create my photographs. I'm often working in really deep waters, with this photograph actually, believe it or not, being taken during our dry season. But in our wet season, I'm often in waters that range anywhere from my mid thigh up to my chest and my neck, where I'm having to carry my gear over my head and trying to, find a tree where I can hang my bags and set everything up. So it's a lot different, a lot kind of harsher conditions you're working with, not to mention trying to avoid some alligators in water with them. Some of the other things I've been doing with these trips and kind of helping me get out there as well is doing trips out, acting as kind of a photo guide for other artists and other photographers. So last spring, mine and Lynn's former professor from RIT, Eric Kunzman, came down to work on his own project for Fujifilm. So we've spent a few days out in Big Cypress National Preserve, which is one of the main areas I photograph in, exploring some of the newer areas that I haven't been to, and also this new area that he's never been to that we could use for both of our projects. I've also done a trip with a group of artists that I've started working with and collaborating with down in Miami. They're a group known as A1A. And so we went out with a bunch of us. I think there was like 8 of us that went out for the day and a couple of us that camped. We went out on New Year's Eve and just explored this whole region and getting to show them around. It became this really interesting practice by bringing in other artists who, not just photographers, but also fashion designers, gallery owners, and curators, kind of mixed media artists as well, painters, drawers, more. So it's been interesting to help bring them into the field and kind of show them the landscape that I have just completely fallen in love with and I enjoy so much, and seeing the ways that they approach photographing and documenting this place. So, like I said, I'm continuing to work on cypress and sawgrass here and there, but for the most part, I've taken a bit of a hiatus from it to really kind of dive in on some newer projects and try to explore some new themes and just kind of giving myself a little break, right? So that's where we move into my newest and current project that I started back in the fall of 2025. This is also, today is the first time I've actually ever gotten to talk about this project completely fully. So you guys are some of the first people to actually hear about this project. So this is my new current project, In Presence and Absence, that I've started. And it's very different, once again, from my previous work, especially among cypress and sawgrass. So with this project, the simplest explanation for it is it's meant to be an exploration and this introspective on the concept and idea of home. So the beginning of 2025, I started teaching here at St. Petersburg College in Pinellas County, Florida, which is a county within Tampa Bay, while still living in Southwest Florida with my mom. So during that time, I was commuting every week one way for 2 to 2.5 hours to teach. 4 to 5 hours every week round trip. Originally, that first spring that I started teaching, I was only teaching 1 day a week. But as the semesters passed and moved on, especially into the summer and then into last fall, I began working more days within the week and began spending half of my weeks in Fort Myers and then the other half in hotels, sometimes campsites, in Clearwater, and then just on the road. So as time went on with this commute, I began contemplating my existence between those two locations. And I began to struggle quite a bit with those emotions to the locations and a bit with my own emotional health and mental health. I essentially was feeling this kind of imposter syndrome where I felt as if I didn't belong anywhere. And I didn't know where home was for me because basically my life had just become this nomadic lifestyle for me. And I've been used to this nomadic lifestyle for a bit, especially with my trips out into nature and camping. But it was just this same routine over and over again that really started to wear me down. So at the time, my social circle had just completely collapsed. I was not seeing many of my old friends as often or anymore at all. Some of my old friends from Fort Myers had moved out of that city into different places. And so it turned into my only social interactions being with my mom back home, the bartenders at restaurants that I regularly had lunch and dinner at, my students, and my colleagues. I became just completely isolated and not really socializing with anybody and just stuck by myself. I also began to notice that anytime I would travel to and from Fort Myers and Clearwater, I had this sense of homesickness, even though I couldn't quite put my finger on which one was home for me and which one wasn't. It was really beginning to drag me down. It was even starting to cause issues with my own work and even inhibiting some of my abilities as an instructor. So eventually, one day, as I was getting ready to leave campus, I began to have just a breakdown over these thoughts. I was starting to feel homesick for having to go back to Fort Myers, even though Fort Myers was my, I guess, home at the time, or my place of residence, right? So I just felt lost. I didn't know where I belonged. I was living between these two cities on the road, and I became stuck in this artistic limbo where I just had no ideas to create any projects. I didn't have any kind of inspiration or drive to go out and photograph. I was kind of losing my interest in just going out and creating my own projects. So I ended up talking to a friend about those emotions and how I was feeling and how to navigate them. And then later on, after chatting with one of my students who wanted to create a project in a similar style, I started getting the idea to create my, my own project exploring my feelings and this notion of home. So after some of these chats, I began to kind of plan out with this project a different way of photographing. In the past, I've been more focused on the documentation of the landscape and the subjects to tell a story, especially in among cypress and sawgrass. But with this project, I've become more focused on reacting off emotions to create the photographs, taking in the moment as I see it and recognizing my surroundings and paying attention to them and reacting off a specific emotion I have in that given moment, whether it's happiness, sadness, wonder, history, and so on. So I keep my camera or a couple cameras on me at all times when I'm just driving around, running errands, heading up to campus and to work. And I'll take photographs based off the emotions that I feel when I'm examining those surroundings. So each photograph in this project is based off a specific emotion I felt in that given moment, taking the time to recognize that emotion and to investigate my surroundings. I was also starting now with this project, primarily working in film. I've done a little bit with digital, but I've switched over to mainly doing film because I find film helps slow me down and really take in the moments as I'm limited to the amount of shots I have. When I was also exploring this notion idea of home, I looked at a quote from Herman Hesse's 1920 novel Wandering when I was doing my research. A lot of my work, I do a lot of research behind the projects and the concepts, kind of start getting some ideas with it. So in the quote from his novel, he states, home is neither here nor there, home is within you, or home is nowhere at all. So upon the contemplation of this quote, I started to ask myself, is home the place that you reside, where you can always return to for rest and sustenance, or is it the places you go to in order to unwind and clear your head? Is it their coffee shops you go to, the parks you go and relax at, and hammock at? Is it going to the beach? Any of these locations? And does home rely on the people you always turn to for joy, comfort, and support, but feel empty and in a void in their absence? Or in my personal case, had this just nomadic lifestyle of constantly being on the road between the two destinations become my home? So I began photographing things I saw along those routes, and whenever I was in each of these locations, going into downtown areas, different neighborhoods, even sometimes photographing on the campus. So, like I said, and even rest stops, downtown areas, and even as you saw on the first slide of this project, just photographing from my car, capturing that kind of moving landscape. So, like I said, I've been mainly creating this project on film. I've mainly been working in medium format and large format 4x5 sheet film, as it helps me to really slow down and take in those locations, like I've said. And again, I'm limited on those shots. On my medium format 120 camera, my 6.6 camera, I'm limited to only 12 shots a roll. And then with the 4x5, I'm only limited to however many sheet holders and how much sheets of film I have. So I'm really, really slowing myself down to really take in the moments around me. I've been primarily photographing this project in black and white when I first started, as I have access to black and white darkroom at the school I teach at. But I've recently started developing my own color film at home. So now I'm starting to implement some more color film to it. With this project as well, I was originally only planning to photograph in Fort Myers and in Clearwater, Pinellas County, but I started to spread that project outside of these locations, but still focusing on reacting based off the emotions and the moment and the given moment when I am in these locations and these places or with people. So, for an example, visiting my friends in Miami, the artists that I went out to in Big Cypress, where we're relaxing at their own homes, having a little art party, and in the homes where they know they belong, where they have found this sense of notion of home, which then contrasts with the way that I felt and the emotions that I felt, having this sense of not belonging anywhere and not really knowing where home was and just feeling lost. So, at the beginning of this year, I moved up to St. Petersburg, Florida. So I no longer am taking that long commute, but I'm still exploring this project, especially now that this is a new residence for me. I still consider kind of Fort Myers my home, Southwest Florida my home, but I'm now living in a new residence in a different part of the state up here in Tampa Bay. Like I said, in undergrad, I went to the University of Tampa, so I'm a little bit familiar with the Tampa Bay area and a little familiar with St. Pete. So it is an area that I'm both familiar and unfamiliar with. So I began photographing in the areas around me, with this being that new residence and really paying attention to this kind of new landscape, if you will, and these new surroundings. So I've been focused primarily on areas around my neighborhood and my apartment, doing regular walks with my cameras and just photographing what I see based off the emotions I see and everything around me. Actually, I did one of these photo walks yesterday afternoon, just again looking at my surroundings and reacting off of what I see and understanding this place as my residence and trying to understand the notion of home. I've also started implementing more large format photography, as well as going out sometimes at night looking for the locations near me or around me that I often see during the daytime when I'm traveling to and from, whether I'm going out for dinner, coming back from classes, and so on and so forth. I want to start photographing these places at night to kind of put them in a new light as well, because the changing in the scenery becomes so much more interesting, especially exploring things like motels and hotels, because that's where I was essentially living for the first entirety of 2025, as well as just kind of in my truck and on the road. So those hotels, those motels became kind of a big symbolism within the work and the project. So I'm continuing this project. It's very much still in its early phases, and I'm wanting to start implementing some portraiture with the work, especially portraiture of the people around me that I interact with, as a way to touch on that question: if home is with the people you find comfort with and enjoy being around, and then feel, empty in their absence. So I want to kind of build onto that as well and start working with some of my close friends and my colleagues, creating portraits of them. And with this project as well, I've started to find that it's giving me some partial answers to those questions that I have. Whether it's home means it's the people, or if home means the place, or if home can be both. It hasn't given me complete questions, because sometimes I think, okay, home is the people I'm with, but then there's times where I'm like, no, home's the place I am. So it's become an interesting kind of examination, introspective on the sense of home. Like I said, I'm still very much in the beginning phase of this project. One of the other things with this project is I have some plans with it, but I'm not going into it entirely with the full thought out plan like I did with Among Cypress and Sawgrass and the lines between the lyrics. I'm very much trying to just let my emotions take the wheel and then let the photographs create the project for themselves, and seeing what comes from the project, and ultimately letting the sequencing and the experimentation with the project, the photographs, build it in itself. And kind of just letting go of that very hard or the very strict kind of planning with the project. So that basically wraps up my talk. So got to talk with you guys a lot about everything I've done. I've done quite a bit. I like to explain my art practice, my style is a reflection on my brain, a lot of ADHD. So it's been a really big blast getting to share all of these projects with you. So thank you guys so much for having me. I've really enjoyed getting to talk to you guys. And of course, if we have questions, feel free.
Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask Chan? Seeing a few head nods, no, so far. Well, I have
Head
one
nods,
for
no.
you.
You got one for me? All right, hit
I
me.
do. So you have worked in a lot of different styles, as well as within like digital-based media and film-based media. How did you really start to develop or find your artistic voice, especially early on in your career? Was it largely through these contracted positions working with magazines, or did you be able to kind of find your voice through your own personality? How did that kind of develop?
A little bit of both, I want to say. Especially that earlier work that I was doing kind of based off of mental health. That was really based off my own personality and experiences. But I would say that my current work is more built on that sense of the photojournalism I worked with, and especially working in kind of more of a documentary style. Because I've moved away from kind of that self-portraiture work and the kind of examination of myself, and focus more on the documentation of the places around me and what I've seen. So that commercial kind of photojournalism work, I would say, is definitely built more into my kind of style and my focuses and what I'm exploring. Kind of taking some of the same practices that I used in my photojournalism and applying it to what I've done or what I'm now doing in my own kind of contemporary series.
All right, a little follow-up for you then. Do you have any advice for early photographers on how to continue to develop their own kind of photographic voice and finding kind of what subject matter they're interested in? What's your advice for young artists?
I mean, what I kind of tell my students a lot is just experimenting. It's just trying to just kind of get a feel for it. You know, when you guys take these classes, I'm sure, Lynn, you with your classes, you're having them do kind of different projects that can explore different subjects and genres or concepts with it. So having that opportunity to just kind of really explore what you're doing, and also examining other artists can help you a lot with trying to get that style and really starting to feel what you're interested or what you want to do. Also think about, for as an artist, think about the things that interest you. You know, start thinking just simple, like, well, what's my hobbies? What do I really enjoy doing? You know, is it going out and hiking and enjoying nature? Do I like to cook? Maybe play around with some still life photography and things like that. Or is it that I just like to socialize? So I want to, document portraiture, my friends, do a little Nan Golden with it, right? So I think, and when you're early starting off, it's helpful to kind of build off of your own kind of hobbies and interests to really start developing that style. And then with that style, you can take it further into other conceptual projects, whether it's about yourself or if it's about, another topic project that's meant to be as more of a kind of documentation. That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I had another one and I've forgotten it. Scatterbrained artist syndrome.
That's us. Two peas in a pod.
So now that you've kind of been developing further into like film and alternative based techniques, do you feel that the choice of using film, is it more of an aesthetic choice or is it that ability to slow you down? What kind of transition moment occurred from someone who had worked very primarily digital for a long time and was against film, if I remember correctly, in
Yeah.
grad school? To now wanting to actually utilize that medium for what purpose?
Yeah, well, for backgrounds, everybody knows, Lynn knows I was very anti-film in grad school, so everyone's shocked now that I'm doing it. But for me, I was interested in getting back into film because I was popping in a lot to the darkroom class last semester with my colleague and those students. So I started kind of just shooting more black and white with them and developing with them just to kind of try get some back into it and something new. But when it comes to actually creating the projects, it's definitely that practice of having it slow me down and really, really think about it. Because I find myself when I'm working in digital, even with the landscape work, is I'm shooting, I mean, I'm spending time in location, setting up my tripod, right? I'll be in one location photographing for upwards of 4 hours just in one little small area. And so, but I still find myself shooting pretty rapidly and just kind of just photographing these moments. Usually, I felt like they were more from an aesthetic standpoint. So, working with the film is mainly focused on that ability to slow myself down and to really take in what's around me. I wouldn't say it's as much as the aesthetic look to it. For me, it's more of, again, definitely that kind of slowing down and taking my time and not letting myself just shoot rapidly, go home, and then have to sort through all these photographs.
Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you have any advice for trying to get more involved with these protest groups, both as a documenter and as an artist?
Yeah. Could you hear that
Yeah.
question or should I
Yes.
repeat
Yes.
it?
Yes.
Okay.
Good question. Yeah. So when it comes to getting into these protests, I mean, first just go out to them as much as you can. I really started getting into it. And when I first kind of went out, I didn't really know a lot of people, but then I started chatting with some of the other creative loafing photographers. And I also had been published already with creative loafing kind of earlier from my days at the Gasparilla Music Festival. So the editor in chief knew me a little bit. So I just reached out to him and just told him, hey, here's some photographs I took at this protest. You publish them if you want, right? And so utilizing them. So I got a little bit lucky because I already knew that publication there. But other helpful things that you can do is just go to these protests and just start chatting with the people at the protests and getting to know them. I had a lot of people come up to me and ask me about my photography, right? And then chat with some of the photojournalists there and tell them like you're interested in getting into this. Look at some smaller publications within your local area. Reach out to them and just offer to kind of contribute photographs to them for these protests, right? and start to build a relationship with them. That's really what we did, especially during Black Lives Matter. And you want to make sure that you're, explaining to people like what you're doing and what you are there to photograph as well. Because once you kind of really explain to people what you are wanting to document, what you are photographing, and that you're here to support, and that, especially as I explained it to people, is photography was my artistic voice. Creating photographing these protests was very much my own form of protest in a way. It was my way of explaining, my freedom of speech and being able to talk about kind of these issues that I'm, supporting and I want to be, changed and fixed. So it's definitely just get out there as much as you can, chat with people, ask, grab, photographs of people and talk to the other photographers you see there. Building a relationship with other photographers as well is a big helpful one as well. I've got a lot of photography friends that I met through protests that I still work with as well. So does that answer your question at all?
Yes.
And
Yep.
kind of going off of that slightly, like Chan had mentioned, that many of these photographers also travel around to the various protests throughout the
Yeah.
country, and they build their own connections through magazines, not only within the locations that they're shooting or news stations, but also like globally or nationally too. And so talking with any of the photojournalists that are around, because there is a wide connection, not just within for us, Minneapolis, kind of Wisconsin area, but also throughout the entire country. So connecting with those people as you see them. If you see a camera in hand, say hi and get to
Yeah,
know
say
them.
hi.
They're not scary people usually.
They're not, yeah, they're not scary people at all. Like, yeah, like kind of what Lynn was saying, like I think I told Lynn about like my buddy Dave Decker. I used to work with him primarily with creative loafing, but he's now shooting for like Axios and Vice News and other places. He does kind of now, he shoots for a bunch of different publications and covering kind of these protests, political rallies, so on. He was actually up kind of earlier last year up in Minnesota, photographing up in there. So, and he's been in Seattle. He's been all over the place. So he's become a pretty big name among protest photography and photojournalism.
Any other questions for Chan? No, I think that's all for us
That's
here.
all? Okay, cool. Thanks for having me, guys. Really enjoyed getting to talk with you guys. I mean, if
Yeah.
anybody comes up, you can, if you want, you can give as soon as my email as well. So if they have any other questions, feel free to reach out.
I have Chandler's website linked on our Canvas as well. So if you are interested in checking out more of his work on his website, and you can also contact him through the website, or Instagram is usually a great spot. That's where we chat most often. So it's a really easy spot to get a hold of him if you have any questions or want to just get to know Chan a little bit more. And if you're interested in SPE, he will be there as well. So
Yep,
yeah.
coming up.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Shanna. I am going to end our recording here for us.
Cool.